Through the iron sights of a Winchester rifle, 60 yards was the exact distance where a man's face dissolved from a threat into a target. Clara Miller stood frozen on the frost-dusted roof, the steel barrel resting against the cold limestone chimney as 7 riders broke into a sudden gallop through her front gate. The lead horse churned the wet Wyoming earth, its rider raising a gleaming revolver toward the house where her ailing mother lay trapped. Clara felt the icy mountain wind biting at the fresh blood on her knuckles, her heart hammering like a trapped bird against her ribs. She didn't flinch. She pressed her cheek against the walnut stalk, held her breath, and tightened her finger on the trigger. The autumn air in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains carried the bitter, sharp scent of crushed sage, wet pine, and the damp promise of coming snow. It was a cold that didn't merely sit on the skin. It seeped deep into the bones, heavy and unforgiving. Clara took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the iron discipline her father had drilled into her take control. 10 miles to the south, beyond the rolling amber grasslands, a thick ribbon of dust was still rising against the bruised gray sky. Those 7 riders were not coming to negotiate. They were coming to take the only thing the Miller family had left. Beneath the roof shingles, inside the warm pine kitchen, the quiet, dry cough of her mother, Sarah, echoed softly. Sarah was 68 years old, her hands gnarled by decades of hard prairie labor, and her lungs weakened by the brutal mountain winters. But it wasn't the weather that had broken Sarah Miller. It was the shame. 10 years ago, the United States War Department had branded Lieutenant Thomas Miller, Clara's father, a thief and a traitor. The official reports claimed he had stolen $40,000 in Army payroll and deserted his unit during a deadly Dakota blizzard. Thomas had spent his final years in a damp, dark cell at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, coughing up blood and swearing his innocence until his heart finally stopped. The town of Pine Bluffs had never forgiven the Miller name. The cold stares and bitter whispers followed Clara whenever she rode her bay horse into town for flour or medicine. "There goes the traitor's girl," they would mutter behind closed doors. Yet Clara knew the truth. She had read every letter her father sent from his cell. She remembered the unyielding integrity of the man who had taught her how to track wounded deer, how to read the mountain winds, and how to hold a rifle steady when the world was shaking. Thomas Miller was no thief. The true criminal sat comfortably in a leather armchair 5 miles away, Colonel Garrett Vance. Vance had been Thomas's commanding officer during the war. He had orchestrated the theft himself, framed his loyal lieutenant, and used the blood money to build an empire of timber and cattle. Now Vance was the most powerful land baron in the territory. But one obstacle stood between him and complete control of the valley, the Miller Ranch, which sat directly across the only year-round water spring for 20 miles. More importantly, Vance knew that hidden somewhere inside the Miller home was Thomas's personal military logbook, the one piece of evidence that could expose Vance's respectable life as a lie. The thunder of iron-shod hoofbeats suddenly cut through the howling wind. Old Hank, their nearest neighbor, pulled his lathered bay gelding to a hard halt at the wooden gate. His face was pale, his breathing ragged, and his hands trembled against the leather reins. "Clara!" Hank shouted, his voice strained with panic as he looked up at the porch. "You need to hitch the wagon and get your mother out of here right now." Clara stepped down to the top wooden stair, her tall frame rigid, her dark eyes calm. "Calm down, Hank. What's happened?" "It's Vance," Hank gasped, wiping a mixture of sweat and rain from his forehead with a trembling sleeve. "He bought up the back taxes on your land from the bank in town this morning. He's got 6 hired guns with him, vicious men from the southern border who don't care about badges or law. He's riding out here to serve an eviction paper himself, or burn the place to the ground if you refuse to leave." "Where is Sheriff Hayes?" Clara asked softly, her voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline in her chest. "Sheriff Hayes is 10 miles out at the North Ridge investigating a staged cattle rustling," Hank said, shaking his head bitterly. "Vance timed this perfectly, Clara. He knows you're alone here with Sarah. Ride to my place. My sons and I can hide you in the barn." Clara turned her head slightly, looking back through the open doorway toward the kitchen stove where her mother sat, wrapped in a faded wool shawl. She thought of Sarah's fragile joints, which would never survive a rough wagon ride through a freezing rainstorm. Then her gaze drifted down to the pine floorboards of her father's study. "I can't run, Hank," Clara said gently, looking back at the old neighbor. "And I will not let those men drag my mother out into the mud." "Clara, they're armed with repeating rifles," Hank pleaded, his eyes wide with fear. "You're only 24 years old. What can one girl do against 7 hardened killers?" Clara looked Hank dead in the eye, her jaw set with the same fierce resolve her father had carried into battle. "My father was a lieutenant in the 4th Cavalry, Hank. He didn't raise me to run from thieves. You ride back to your family and lock your doors." Seeing the unyielding iron in the young woman's posture, Hank slumped his shoulders in defeat. "May the Lord watch over you, child," he whispered, turning his horse and galloping away into the timber. Clara watched him go until the trees swallowed his silhouette. She took a deep breath, taking the metallic twang of coming rain on her tongue. The dust trail on the southern horizon was growing larger, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Her time was up. Clara turned, stepped inside, and pulled the heavy oak door shut against the storm, ready to uncover the weapon her father had left behind. The kitchen was warm, filled with the rich, comforting aroma of stewed apples, wood smoke, and dark-roasted coffee. Sarah Miller sat in her high-backed rocking chair, beside the cast-iron stove, a thick wool blanket draped tightly around her thin shoulders. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat silver bun, and her pale blue eyes watched her daughter with a fragile mixture of maternal tenderness and deep-seated apprehension. "Was that Hank on the road, Clara?" Sarah asked, her raspy voice breaking the quiet hum of the kettle. "Is something wrong out in the valley?" Clara crossed the room and knelt beside her mother's chair, taking Sarah's cold, thin hands into her own calloused palms. She forced a warm, steady smile to her lips, suppressing the cold dread settling in her chest. "Just a storm rolling down from the peaks, Ma." Clara lied softly, her tone measured and calm. "The wind is going to get real rough by afternoon. I want you to go down into the storm cellar under the pantry. It's warm down there, and I've set up the cot with fresh wool blankets." Sarah frowned, her sharp eyes searching Clara's face. "Clara, you never put me in the cellar for a rainstorm. What aren't you telling me?" "I'm telling you that I'm taking care of this home just like Papa would," Clara said, gently pressing a kiss to her mother's wrinkled forehead. "Trust me, Ma. Slide the iron latch from the inside and do not open it until I call your name. Promise me." Recognizing the fierce, unyielding determination in her daughter's eyes, the exact look Thomas Miller used to carry before leading his men into the Dakota blizzards, Sarah nodded slowly. "I promise, child, but don't you do anything foolish." Once Sarah was safely settled on the small cot beneath the kitchen floorboards, Clara bolted the trapdoor and covered it with a heavy rag rug. The farmhouse felt deathly silent now, save for the steady ticking of the brass mantel clock and the rising howl of the autumn gale outside. Clara walked with purpose into her parents' bedroom. She stepped over to the heavy oak bedstead, pulled back the braided rug, and dropped to her knees on the cold floor. Using a flat iron chisel, she pried up 2 loose pine floorboards, revealing the dark, dry earth beneath. Resting in the hidden space was a long bundle wrapped tightly in heavy oil-soaked canvas, and beside it, a brass-bound leather dispatch box. Clara lifted the leather box first. Inside lay her father's leather-bound military logbook, its pages filled with Thomas's precise handwriting. It detailed every illegal rifle transaction, every altered voucher, and every stolen payroll chest orchestrated by Garrett Vance 10 years ago. It was the truth. Her father had died protecting the evidence that would finally clear his name. Then Clara turned to the canvas bundle. She unrolled the thick fabric with slow, deliberate movements. The dim light of the bedroom caught the dull steel barrel of a Model 1873 Winchester lever-action rifle. It was meticulously maintained, its dark walnut stock polished to a smooth grain smelling faintly of gun oil and cold brass. Beside the rifle lay a heavy leather bandolier laden with brass cartridges. Clara ran her fingers along the smooth receiver, and memories came rushing back with overwhelming clarity. She remembered quiet Sunday afternoons in the meadow, behind the barn, her father standing right behind her, his large hands guiding her elbows. She could still hear his patient voice echoing in her ear. "Keep your cheek firm against the stock, Clara. Don't fight the recoil. Know your distance, read the wind, and never pull the trigger unless you mean to kill what you're aiming at." She picked up the bandolier and slung it across her chest. One by one, she pressed the heavy cartridges into the Winchester's brass loading gate. The metallic clicks echoed loudly in the empty bedroom, crisp and mechanical. Click, click, click. 14 rounds in the tubular magazine. One worked into the chamber. Clara picked up a tin bucket of fresh water and a small leather satchel containing extra ammunition. She walked out through the back kitchen door into the icy drizzle that had just begun to fall over the yard. Leaning against the rear wall of the barn was a sturdy wooden ladder leading up to the farmhouse roof. The roof was steeply pitched, but right beside the massive limestone chimney, her father had built a flat, reinforced wooden platform years ago for sweeping winter soot. It sat high above the yard, providing a complete, unobstructed view of the main road and the front gate. Clara climbed the rungs slowly and carefully, the heavy Winchester slung tight across her back. She reached the top, stepped onto the wet timber platform, and crouched behind the thick stones of the chimney. The view from up here was vast and open. The Bighorn Valley stretched out in shades of amber and dark green under the bruised sky. The freezing rain began to soak into her wool coat, but she didn't shiver. She set her water bucket down, placed her extra cartridges on a dry towel, and rested the dull steel barrel of the Winchester against the stone corner. She closed her left eye and peered through the iron sights, measuring the yard in her mind, just as her father had taught her on those quiet afternoons. "The front wooden gate is 60 yards, she whispered aloud, her breath pluming white against the cold air. "The big ponderosa pine is 90 yards. The edge of the dry creek bed is 150. She checked the receiver to make sure it remained dry from the drizzle, then cleared her throat and settled her cheek against the wood. The dust trail on the southern road had vanished, replaced by the distinct silhouettes of 7 men on horseback, riding at a steady trot toward her fence. Clara took a slow, deep breath, tightened her grip, and waited for the confrontation that would decide her family's fate. Colonel Garrett Vance rode at the center of the formation, looking more like a wealthy politician than a land thief. He wore a tailored wool overcoat with a dark beaver pelt collar, his silver beard trimmed with meticulous precision. To his right rode Jasper, a young, eager gunman who kept twirling a pearl-handled revolver with arrogant flair. To his left rode Elias, an older man with deeply lined skin and a heavy repeating rifle slung across his saddle, a veteran who had served under Thomas Miller decades ago and knew the true weight of violence. The 7 riders pulled their horses to a halt just outside the wooden gate, 70 yards from the porch. The autumn drizzle dripped steadily from the brims of their hats, darkening the dry earth beneath their hooves. "Sarah Miller!" Vance shouted, his booming voice carrying easily over the howl of the wind. "Come out onto the porch. I hold the lawful deed to this property, and I intend to collect." Inside the farmhouse, there was no movement. The front door remained firmly shut. Vance sneered, turning his head toward the young gunman beside him. "Jasper, ride up there and kick that front door off its hinges. If the old woman fusses, throw her in the back of the wood wagon." Jasper grinned, spurring his horse forward. The wooden gate swung open with a creak. The horse trotted into the yard, kicking up wet clods of dirt. 80 yards, 70 yards, 60 yards. Jasper drew his pearl-handled revolver, aiming it casually toward the front kitchen window. "Come on out, widow. Let's see if you—" Crack! The thunderous roar of the Winchester shattered the cold rain. Up on the roof. Clara did not aim for the young man's heart. At the last fraction of a second, she shifted her iron sights slightly to the right. The heavy lead bullet struck Jasper square in his right shoulder joint. The force of the impact lifted him straight out of his saddle, throwing him backward into the freezing mud. His revolver flew into the wet grass unfired and forgotten. "Sniper!" Elias yelled, his veteran instincts kicking in instantly. "Get down!" Panic erupted at the gate. Horses reared and screamed in terror, kicking wild hooves into the air. Vance's confident smile vanished, replaced by pale, paralyzed shock. He fumbled frantically beneath his heavy wool coat for his own sidearm, his hands slick with cold rain. Up on the chimney platform, Clara's hands moved with practiced mechanical rhythm. She racked the brass lever down and slammed it back up. A smoking brass casing spun through the freezing air, ringing softly against the limestone before bouncing off the roof tiles. A fresh cartridge slid smoothly into the chamber. She tracked Vance through the iron sights. He was the commander. He was the thief who had stolen her father's honor. Crack! The second shot struck Vance squarely in the center of his chest. The force drove the breath from his lungs in a red spray. Vance dropped his weapon, slumped forward over his saddle horn, and slid lifelessly off his mare, crashing face down into the mud beside the wooden gatepost. "The colonel's hit!" One of the hired guns screamed in terror. Two of the younger cowboys didn't hesitate. They yanked their horses around, dug their spurs in violently, and fled down the south road at a breakneck gallop, abandoning their employer without a second thought. A third gunman, blinded by sheer panic, began firing his revolver wildly at the front door, shattering the lower glass panes. Clara calmly levered another round, shifted her aim, and fired a heavy bullet directly into the mud between the gunman's boots. Wet earth exploded over his pants. The man froze, looked up at the stone chimney, dropped his empty revolver, and sprinted away on foot toward the open prairie as fast as his legs could carry him. In less than 40 seconds, 7 gunmen had been reduced to 2, Jasper groaning in the mud and Elias. Elias had not panicked. The moment the first shot echoed, he had thrown himself off his horse, rolling into the dirt, and taking cover behind the thick oak water trough near the porch. He pressed his back against the wet wood, breathing heavily, his mind racing. He tilted his head back, looking past the edge of the porch roof toward the limestone chimney. Through the falling rain, he saw the thin wisp of gray gun smoke curling away from the stone. He saw the dull steel barrel of a Winchester resting perfectly steady against the brick. "That ain't no old widow," Elias muttered to himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. "That's a military marksmanship." Elias raised his heavy rifle, resting the barrel on the edge of the oak trough. He took a steady breath, aligned his sights with the right side of the chimney, and squeezed the trigger. Bang! The bullet smashed into the limestone inches from Clara's face. A sharp chunk of stone exploded outward, slicing across her left cheekbone. Hot blood welled up instantly, mixing with the cold rain on her skin and dripping onto her collar. Clara ducked low against the wet shingles, pressing her hand to her bleeding cheek. Her heart hammered wildly, and the metallic taste of copper filled her mouth. "Breathe," she whispered to herself, closing her eyes for a single second. "Read the wind. Hold the line." Below, Elias called out, his voice rough against the gale. I know who you are up there. You've got your father's eye, girl, but you can't stay behind that stone forever. Give it up. Vance is dead. The fight's over. Clara wiped the blood from her eye with her sleeve. She peered around the left side of the chimney. She had 5 rounds left in the magazine. Elias was protected by the heavy oak trough, but the torrential rain was filling the yard with deep, slick mud, trapping him in place. Clara raised her rifle, aiming not at Elias, but at the rusted iron hoop holding the wooden water trough together. Crack! The heavy bullet struck the iron ring precisely. The rusted metal snapped with a loud clang. Hundreds of gallons of trapped water burst out at once, sweeping the heavy oak planks aside and soaking Elias in a wall of freezing water and mud. Elias tumbled backward into the open yard, his rifle slipping from his numb, mud-slicked fingers. Before he could reach for his sidearm, the sharp metallic click of a lever locking back cut through the silence. Elias froze and looked up. Clara stood tall beside the chimney, her wool coat soaked blood running down her pale cheek, her Winchester aimed dead center at his chest. Her dark eyes were unblinking and entirely devoid of fear. Elias slowly raised his empty, muddy hands into the air. "Don't shoot," he breathed, his voice trembling in the cold. "I'm done, child. I'm done." The torrential rain gradually softened into a fine, chilly drizzle, leaving the Bighorn Valley wrapped in a profound, heavy stillness. The frantic echoes of gunfire were replaced by the steady patter of water dripping from the barn eaves and the pained, quiet whimpers of young Jasper lying by the front gate. Clara kept her cheek pressed against the walnut stock of the Winchester, her finger resting firm against the trigger guard as she looked down from the stone chimney. "Stand up slowly, Elias," she commanded, her voice cutting sharp and clear through the mountain mist. "Kick your rifle away." Elias used the toe of his mud-soaked boot to push his weapon into the wet grass, raising his hands high above his head. "Vance lied to us, Clara," he said, his raspy voice trembling with a mixture of cold and genuine remorse. "He told us your father was a coward and a thief, but I served under Thomas Miller at Fort Laramie. I knew the man. I should have known better than to take Vance's gold. My father's military logbook is inside this house, preserved beneath the floorboards," Clara said, her tone unyielding. "It contains every altered voucher and every stolen payroll ledger bearing Vance's signature. If you want to walk away from this valley alive, you will stand before the sheriff and tell him the truth." Elias bowed his head, staring at the lifeless body of Garrett Vance lying in the mud. "I will," he swore softly. "On my honor as a soldier, Clara, I'll tell Hayes everything." 15 minutes later, the muffled thud of galloping hooves and the wooden creak of heavy wagon wheels echoed down the southern road. Sheriff Hayes rode into the yard, flanked by 2 armed deputies and old Hank in his wooden buckboard. The young sheriff yanked his horse to a sudden halt, his jaw slackening as his eyes took in the scene. Colonel Vance dead beside the gate, Jasper clutching his bleeding shoulder, Elias standing unarmed in the mud, and Clara Miller descending the wooden barn ladder with a bloody bandage pressed to her cheek, a repeating rifle resting securely in her hands. Sheriff Hayes dismounted hastily, stepping through the churned earth toward the porch. "Miss Miller, Lord above, what happened here?" Garrett Vance came to enforce a fraudulent deed and destroy the evidence of his own treason, Sheriff, Clara said, her voice remarkably calm. She stepped off the bottom rung and handed him the heavy leather dispatch box she had retrieved from her father's study. "My father's official logs are inside. They prove Thomas Miller was framed 10 years ago." Sheriff Hayes opened the brass latch, his eyes racing across the weathered ink pages. Beside him, Elias took a step forward, addressing the officer directly. "She's telling the truth, Hayes," Elias said, his voice solemn. Vance forged the land claim, and he forged the army reports back in '69. Thomas Miller died an innocent man. I'm ready to sign a full confession regarding my part in this ride. Sheriff Hayes looked up from the logbook toward the towering limestone chimney on the roof, then back down at Clara's unyielding posture. A profound look of reverence washed over the young officer's face. 7 hardened men rode out here to erase this ranch. Clara, how in God's name did you stand against them alone? Clara looked past the gate toward the eastern ridge where the dark storm clouds were finally beginning to part, allowing thin golden shafts of late afternoon sunlight to pierce the gray sky. I didn't fight 7 men, Sheriff, Clara answered softly. I shot the thief who was paying them. Once the paycheck was dead, the truth was all that remained. The deputies loaded Vance's body into the buckboard and helped the weeping Jasper onto a spare horse to be treated by the town doctor. Sheriff Hayes promised that by noon the following day, the circuit judge in Cheyenne would officially clear Lieutenant Thomas Miller's name and restore full legal title of the water spring to the family. When the wagons finally turned and rolled away into the timber, the ranch fell into a peaceful, sacred quiet. Clara walked into the kitchen, unbolted the iron latch of the pantry trap door, and pulled back the heavy oak lid. Sarah was sitting on the narrow cot below, clutching her wooden rosary beads to her chest. When she looked up and saw her daughter standing in the doorway, safe whole though, bearing a thin red line across her cheek, the old woman let out a long, ragged breath and wept tears of profound relief. Clara reached down, lifting her mother out of the dark cellar and wrapping her in a warm blanket by the glowing cast-iron stove. It's over, Ma, Clara whispered, resting her chin gently against her mother's silver hair. Papa's honor is restored. We can finally walk through town with our heads held high. The following morning broke clear, crisp, and brilliantly blue over the Wyoming wilderness. The fierce autumn gale had vanished completely, leaving the mountain air smelling of damp earth-sweet pine and blooming sage. Clara sat on the top step of the front porch, wearing a clean cotton dress, holding a tin cup of steaming black coffee. Beside her sat Sarah, wrapped in her favorite wool shawl, quietly watching the golden sun climb over the Bighorn Peaks. Down in the master bedroom, beneath the pine floorboards, the Winchester rifle lay once again wrapped securely in heavy oil-soaked canvas. It was clean, it was oiled, it was put away. Clara took a slow sip of her coffee, feeling the gentle warmth of the morning sun against her face and the sharp, healing sting on her cheek. A small, proud mark for a family's dignity reclaimed. "What are you thinking about, child?" Sarah asked softly, leaning her tired head against her daughter's shoulder. Clara smiled, her dark eyes sweeping across the lush green pastures that now belonged to them truly and forever. "I was thinking about Papa," Clara said gently, holding her mother's hand tight. "I think he'd say the land looks peaceful today."